Most welcome to this latest in the series of ebbf webinars. We're trying to make sense of the current crisis, but we're also trying to make sense of the future that we want to create. So we're very fortunate today to have two experts, Arthur Dahl and Maja Groff. The topic today is governance, global governance. What on earth does a global governance that helps us today in this emergency, that helps us to cope with this global pandemic, and how can it also help us in the future to build the kind of future that we're looking for, the prosperous, just and sustainable future that we're looking to create? Well, the first question is, so you wrote a book about this theme. So how did that come about? Why do you feel it was a good time to write about it? And how timely that book now results to be?
We're now in the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Maybe it's time to say, lots of things have happened since 1945, and there are all sorts of new things that weren't anticipated at that time. And we're seeing now with the pandemic, one of them, these global things happening much more quickly, climate change is another. Say, what has to be done to fix the system to make it appropriate to the needs of this century as opposed to the 20th century?
Yeah, and I suppose the three co-authors of the book, everybody had the link to the online free version that you can read and download. Here's the hard copy. But Arthur, Augusto, and I, we've always had the passion about global governance, strengthening institutions in our various fields. I'm the international lawyer. Arthur is the international environmental scientist, policymaker. Augusto, the international economist. So we've always had the passion throughout our careers for global governance and making our institutions better. And so as Arthur said, on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter, it seemed like the time was very right. This interface, the interconnection of the global risks that are coming together now and confronting us. And so indeed, it is becoming, the book seems to be becoming even more timely every day. I think what we're going to do was first talk about some of the global governance weaknesses revealed by the pandemic and how that relates to some of our broader proposals in the book, and then make some other comments about our obvious global interdependence and how our thinking needs to shift. So Arthur, do you want to kick it off?
What kind of weaknesses has the pandemic revealed? What are the different elements of things that governance should be trying to respond to? We've known for a long time there was this risk. I mean, nobody remembers anymore the flu, the Spanish flu of 1918. But there was a pandemic that killed millions of people at the time. And so it's always been one of those risks out there, but never taken very seriously as the memory has dropped away. When it has suddenly happened, it's happened much faster than anybody could have expected. I mean, it took some time for ships across the Atlantic with sick soldiers and carry the flu from one country to another. With our modern globalized system and air travel, it's just flipped around the world, and it also being something that is highly contagious. It has spread extremely quickly wherever it has landed, and I think we're far from seeing the end of that. So it's really been unprecedented in both its speed and its geographic scope. It's also demonstrated how vulnerable we are to a globalized system breaking down. And we see it first with everybody competing for supply of masks and respirators and medicines and things like that, where there's a demand all over the world, the supply is not adequate, the rich can buy what they want and the poor suffer the consequences. We also see how, because we're still locked into national sovereignty, it's each country fighting for its own interests. And there's been much less real collaboration than there perhaps should have been to deal with something that is a common threat to everybody. There's a lack of solidarity, and we'll see this even more as the pandemic spreads to the poorer developing countries who don't have the same medical facilities that they have there. And if it really takes off in those countries, there'll be much greater humanitarian disaster than we've even seen so far, where it's affected many of the wealthy countries first. It's another thing that I think we're learning is that it has to be dealt with at a global level. Even if some countries succeed, if other countries are still going through the pandemic, the virus is still circulating, there will still be leakage and possibilities of rebounds. Even if you thought you've solved things, but if it creeps in over the borders, comes in again, it can flare up. And so it's not going to be something that can be put out so easily if it's being handled on a country by country basis. And I think we have to acknowledge it's going to be much longer and more complicated than people have perhaps been hoping, because it has to be dealt with at the global level. We've also not pooled our expertise sufficiently where things have been learned. It hasn't been shared around the world. we have the World Health Organization, but it's always been weak and underfunded. It's not always had its hands free to deal with it. So it's suffered with all of the elements of a UN system that is voluntary and depending on very much on defending national interests and not able to really act completely in the sense of the global interest. So I think those are some of the weaknesses that have come up. If there's nothing is not correlated with whether it's a democracy or an authoritarian government. You could look at Italy and South Korea are both democratic. The way they handled this was very different. Much depends on whether, in fact, there is a governance capacity to respond. So if you don't have strong government to begin with, but even if you decide something, you can't implement it. So what does this say about the global level when countries are very different in how well they're able to implement something, even if it is decided? So we need to strengthen governance more directly. One thing that struck a lot of scientists is that much is dependent on individual leadership. If you have a leader who listens to the science and takes difficult decisions that are unpopular but responds in time, as opposed to a leader who puts politics first or puts the economy first and waits and waits and waits for other reasons, the result is very different. Another thing that has come out is the importance of trust, where people trust their government and believe their government. They're much more ready to obey government's restrictions, to do what the government asks them to. If they don't trust their government, if the government has been corrupt or whatever, and there's been a great failure of trust, even in many democracies, then this weakens the whole ability of the system to respond to a challenge like this. So maybe we can then say, well, how would we look at better global governments to respond? What are the factors that in our proposals for improved governments that might deal with something like a pandemic? First of all, we talk about having legislative capacity, actually being able to pass laws. So if we actually had laws that all governments had to obey, we'd be able to compensate for weaknesses in one part of the world or another because there would be a common global framework within which one could respond. We propose a global executive council, unlike the Security Council, without a veto, and therefore something that could really respond quickly and make quick decisions if they're needed at the global level, with everybody agreeing that this is the decisions that need to be taken. We would clearly see a strengthening WHO, so it would have the technical capacity to take on these challenges in its area and provide the science that is needed and lead the research and so on. More generally, strengthening the capacity of science to influence policymaking, a greater role for science and listening to science and building it more directly into the policy-making process. When you're looking at the whole thing, you're not just dealing with one problem, you're dealing with many problems that are interrelated. So we're looking that this is leading to a perhaps potential financial collapse. The IMF needs to be strong enough to deal with financial collapse at the global level. It isn't at the present time. So again, while this starts as a health issue, it requires other elements of governments to come in and respond to it as well. If we create the international peace force that we propose, then you could call on the military at a global level to fill the gaps in logistics and to provide help where it's needed and move things around and so on. The same way that many countries have called out the army at the national level to help. If we had an international police force, it could also be one of the elements that could help in a rapid, unified response to such a challenge. Also, presumably, if you have better organized governments, you anticipate many of these things. You wouldn't have put off preparing for so long. We would have been able to, in advance, to have a stronger health systems around the world, to reduce some of the inequalities, and be ready to deal with these kinds of challenges.
What's also very important to remember is this is a proposal that has been made that has won a prize. One of the, I think, 14,000 entries were sent in, and this proposal by Arthur, Maja, and Augusto actually won the first prize of this, which is an important funding opportunity. But most importantly, is also exposing these concepts, these ideas to the United Nations and to the global governance that's required. This is not an internal conversation. This is a conversation that's been taken really to the highest level. So even your question that came up later may actually help to build on this and take it forward. Maja, please.
Yeah, and just following on your point, Danielle, that's our conscious intention in the book. We state in the foreword that we really want to start a conversation and to start global conversations on these topics. In terms of the theme of the annual ebbf conference and the theme of this event, rethinking success, it's the UN 75 anniversary. And for me, looking at global governance, I think we should have the aim of success. For example, I think by now, in the 75 years of having the UN Charter, while there has been extraordinary progress and many amazing successes, we're still not there to achieve the really fundamental goals for embedded within the UN Charter. And also, for example, how do we really make sure we're successful in fundamentally implementing and realizing the Sustainable Development Goals, for example? How can we make success in global governance a norm rather than, a vicious cycle of low expectations and sort of constantly being distracted by geopolitical contests, et cetera. So that's also what we're trying to really telegraph in our book is let's have high standards. The UN Charter, when it was adopted in 1945, it was supposed to be reviewed within 10 years. That was part of the compromise when it was negotiated with a lot of the states that weren't the great military powers. They wanted to make sure the institution could evolve and progress, and that this permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council with a veto, that should not be a feature that's retained in the institution. Goal to have the charter reviewed within 10 years was never realized. So again, now it's 75 years later, and it's just sort of logical and rational that we need to relook at this instrument that is now ratified by basically every country in the world accepts it. It's a universal and incredibly inspiring document. If you just want to be inspired, go to the UN Charter text online or in print and read the preamble, read the goals and principles, which are still very profound values which the international community can build on and simply strengthen. And I just wanted to circle back quickly so that Arthur talked about the quality of leadership, having really competent leaders who are service-oriented, who really engage with and rely on technical and scientific knowledge, who are working hard in a collaborative way, integrity of the whole international system. How do we get good leaders and keep good leaders, and what are the values that we can have this sense of like a servant leader? Chapter 18 on corruption, international mechanisms to make sure we try to really seriously stomp out corruption and governance. We have a whole chapter on education for transformation, which includes education for proper leadership, good leadership, and a whole chapter on values and principles, chapter 20. And again, we're value rich really at the moment in the international system. We have so many extraordinary statements and shared norms that states around the world have signed on to. Well, our next step is really about implementation, enforcement, building stronger, true governance mechanisms at the international system. At least 5 weaknesses raised by the pandemic. Firstly, the UN Security Council. There was an article in the New York Times saying that the Security Council was notably absent, deafening silence on the pandemic, even though the UN Secretary General has said that this is the greatest threat to the world since World War II. So countries around the world, citizens are looking to the Security Council to be functional, to take action effectively, to confront really the risks and challenges that are facing us. And so in our book, in chapter 7, we talk about what an effective executive body would look like to replace the UN Security Council. There should be no countries with a veto. There should be some kind of rational formula based on, normal standards of governance legitimacy, so that all countries are represented on the Security Council at all times, and it can take sort of quick executive action across the range of the global risks that confront us. Secondly, peaceful settlement of disputes. The UN Secretary General called for a global ceasefire because these conflicts around the world are really, of course, threaten, impede efforts to fight this pandemic. Do we really have time or the resources for these senseless military conflicts? And indeed, the UN Charter has provisions where there must be peaceful settlement of disputes. But this has not been made enforceable per se by the UN Charter, and we recommend also in our book how to make that obligatory and enforceable. Third, human rights protections. We know actions by certain governments. There's an alarm that in response to the pandemic, for example, human rights might be trampled, or some leaders might take advantage of the vulnerabilities of societies now to entrench sort of human rights infringements. But of course, we know that happens also in the best of times. So in the book also, we talk about how do we really make sure that the UN human rights architecture is ramped up and that it becomes a norm of good governance around the world. At the moment, human rights funding within the UN system is only 3% of UN funding allocation, which is laughable, really. Fourth and fifth, enforcement of international law, and then funding issues that Arthur mentioned. On the enforcement and implementation of international law with the World Health Organization, which of course has played a really admirable leading role in the global pandemic at the moment, but there are binding international health regulations that states negotiated about 15 years ago around the 2003 SARS epidemic, but countries around the world haven't been obeying those regulations, even though 196 countries signed these regulations to say, oh, we want to be bound by these rules. These haven't been respected, and there's no real enforcement power. There's some now suggestions to take certain states to the International Court of Justice, but in fact, as we recommend in our book, the International Court of Justice has to be made a mandatory court. At the moment, states can pick and choose which courts and tribunals they're a part of, but the International Court of Justice, for example, its statute is annexed to the Charter, and only about 40% of states around the world have accepted its jurisdiction. At the international level, states should be held accountable. Then finally, on the funding topic, we have a whole chapter, I think it's chapter 5, about how we make how do we increase the funding for the UN and also make it more reliable so that all the different agencies can just go about their business with their technical expertise, their scientific expertise, and not be held hostage to more powerful countries, but can really do what is in the best interest of the collective. Our current international military investments, which are based on this, every state takes care of their own, national security. There are still sort of regional power contests going on. There's still international military contests going on. It's projected that 2018, there will be $1.8 trillion spent in the world on global military spending. And Augusto, our co-author in a recent blog, noted, in the context of this pandemic, the WHO's budget in 2018-2019 was $478 million, or it would be 3 or 4 very sophisticated fighter jets would be bought by that same amount. So we're spending vast amount on military hardware, for example, to fight potential wars, versus relying on obligatory peaceful settlement of disputes at the International Court of Justice, etc., and also investing in human security, investing in, for example, this global health risk, which many experts knew completely, and policymakers knew that such a pandemic was a massive risk to cause human damage and economic damage. Those are a few of the structural proposals from our book. And Arthur, did you want to say some last words before we open up to questions and comments?
Here we focused on the pandemic in particular. I think we have to also recognize that in this globalized world, there's no such thing as a single risk. We're functioning in a very complex global system, and that system, it's like, that you have a chain of things interact with each other. The weakest link in the chain is the weakness of the whole chain. You cannot deal with these things in isolation. One of the results is, that for the first time in history, the whole world economy has shut down all at once. We've never had that kind of thing before. How do you restart a global economy afterwards? What do you do about all of the fallout from the people who've lost their jobs and the companies SMEs that have gone bankrupt and all the other things? There are a whole series of knock-on challenges that are far from the immediate health issue, but that are all part of this complex problem as it's unfolding, will continue to unfold in the months ahead. We can't even imagine all the different implications, of what may be unfolding, as we go ahead. even on the education level, what happens when you shut down schools around the world and kids miss a lot of their education? And particularly when kids who have computers at home can keep following their classes, but poor kids who don't are suddenly cut off. Also, an enormous peak in marriage breakdowns. Couples that are having to live together 24 hours a day when they used to be able to escape from each other are finding it doesn't work. On the other hand, there's clearly going to be a birth boom in 9 months from now. The pandemic babies, all of the babies will have been born during this time of enforced confinement. Again, we'll see also the other things unfolding from this process that will be part of the complex challenge that we have to try to sort through as we go ahead.
Even more complex risks that are very urgent. We know that we have to act in terms of climate change very, very quickly and make very deep emission cuts within the next decade and be carbon neutral by 2050. These are hugely ambitious goals, and now we're fighting a new global challenge, but we have another one that is probably even more existential to the human community. So I think the kind of global thinking that's raised by the pandemic and this urgency of how do we solve these problems together is just going to intensify as we go forward, which makes it a very different environment for us to try to think how we contribute, how businesses contribute, and to try to scale up our thinking about what we expect and what we can design for our global institutions and global collaboration.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Miguel from Belgium. Now, the problem is that the veto right of some countries is not only used in order not to move, but is also used in order not to reform. What kind of momentum, and maybe this pandemic might be one, what would you suggest as a momentum? Or
one of the purposes of our book was to try to relaunch the debate. For long people have sort of given up in trying to reform the United Nations. And we felt maybe it is time to actually lay out in some detail that it might in fact be possible. But I think this also relates to a question that Josh has asked that sort of follow on this as well. That is, because that the veto power is a veto over change, can we work around that in some way? And we discussed this in some detail with various scenarios for taking this forward in our book. And saying, well, if worse comes to worse, and most reasonable governments are ready to make a step forward, they can do as they did with the League of Nations and the United Nations. You simply create a new institution to replace the old one. And if enough countries are going to create, a united world organization, which is no longer just of nations, but of all the peoples together, fix all the things with it, get it off the ground, give it more money, then it can propose a buyout or a takeover, of the old UN, and the few governments who resist it, which some of those veto power might resist, to the end, would finally be forced, to come on board. So we look at these different options. Ideally, you could like to fix what we have. What can you save of what's been learned before? Can you keep as much as you can of the old system, but fix the fundamental flaws in it and get it off on a stronger basis? So we do see ways around some of these challenges.
Security Council, I think a lot of people share your frustration or observation. I've heard, the head of UN Geneva say, yeah, we've had 25 years of sterile debate on the UN Security Council, and it's not time to it's time to have a different kind of discussion. And also with a call in those comments from within the UN, highly ranked, saying we need help from outside the United Nations. We need civil society engaged. To Arthur's point, in our book and our proposals, it was quite surprising to see how uncommon sort of making sort of bold reform proposals were in the academic literature, sort of in policy circles. I think a lot of people simply gave up during the Cold War, and then maybe we didn't seize the opportunity enough in the 90s that we could have, even though there were some efforts. But also the nature of our proposals on UN Security Council reform, I haven't seen many. There are a few, but most of the reform efforts within the UN system and the dialogues they've had has been just, okay, let's add a few more permanent members. It's not breaking the cycle of this, excessive national interest or egotism. Like, no, there should be a fair system. But I think at this point, the Security Council, there is a lot of criticism constantly about its dysfunctionality, constantly across a whole range of issues, even classical hard security issues. So I think the legitimacy of that apex body is really being discussed, also in the face of climate. This pandemic, of course, the world is looking to it for leadership. But indeed, that formula in the charter was really embedded about blocking that reform proposals, and those countries in negotiations of the they foresaw that and really voiced that they had a problem with it. So there has to be some kind of consciousness. The coalition of the many, the majority of states in the world. There's an alliance for multilateralism with so many middle power states. The states that believe in good governance, who believe in international rule of law and rationality, have to really think it through and try to call for a normative shift. It's already organically happening, but there have to be, I think, an awareness in a critical mass of quote unquote middle power states to really propose sensible forward motion in the UN Charter, including the Security Council.
I had a question regarding also the Security Council. I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think the Security Council can practically do at this point. I could be wrong, but I think the last time, or maybe the only time, again, I could be wrong, that the Security Council declared a health issue a threat to peace and security might have been on AIDS. And they said that the impact of AIDS was as destructive as war. But I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think for this particular pandemic Security Council could do by declaring it, for example, as a threat to peace.
I mean, the Security Council, believe it or not, apart from all the strange, dysfunctional, competitions between countries that happen, especially the permanent members, of course, has shown incredible creativity and sort of responsiveness in some situations. For example, creating the ICTY, the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda Tribunal, which paved the way for the International Criminal Court. Also recognize the importance of women, peace and security, youth, peace and security. And then you're referencing like HIV, talking about the interlinkages with international security. So I think the Security Council, based on its the precedents and the corpus of its resolutions, has plenty of material to draw from to frame a response to the global pandemic in a variety of different ways that are helpful, that will show leadership for the international community. I mean, if I were advising anybody on the security, I would say, look at what the needs are on the ground at the moment, and what can that body, that apex body, provide to support the UN Secretariat, to support the WHO, to support the General Assembly, which is passing a resolution. So I think has many tools in its toolkit.
But my question is more about, given that any kind of international reform, largely, especially in democracies, is based on reforming or at least a domestic acceptance of global governance. What do you think the best way for us as individuals to take practical actions? I guess really it would, I suppose now I'm thinking it would depend really on the region. I'm in Alberta, Canada, which is quite nationalist, though it is but a province. And I'm wondering what kinds of tools do you think are most useful, or I don't want to say arguments, because consultation is most useful in terms of building an acceptance in a domestic level for more broader global governance with more teeth.
It's just, we explore this in our book because we look at the example of Europe after World War II, and where we had a few enlightened leaders who sort of overrode their own national bureaucracies and the resistance to, giving any national sovereignty, and said, let's take something practical and obvious, coal and steel, where France had steel and Germany had coal. They had to rebuild after the war. They said, let's cooperate on a coal and steel community. And having succeeded in that and built some confidence and trust in that, then they were to gradually expand to the Treaty of Rome and built the whole European Union. So one possible way forward would be to say, is there some issue that would resonate in your domestic level where everybody say, this is an obvious place where we need to work globally to address the problem? And say, let's start with something just focusing on that issue. everybody says this is a reasonable way forward, and then from that acceptance, create some trust that in fact the cooperation has worked and has done something, and then build from there. So we had thought that maybe climate change would be an issue that would be one that would be seen as requiring a global response. The pandemic has now emerged as another one. So I just sort of strategically, if you think this is one of these issues would resonate at the domestic level in your own country or wherever you are, as something where yes, clearly there's no alternative to cooperating on this one. Let's agree to do it in this limited area and create a precedent from which you can then build going forward.
Mahmoud can share really quickly in a moment information on his 10,000 conversations project and these proposals about trying to start dialogues around the world. A link to togetherfirst.org, which is something we started with partners to try to further global civil society and public engagement with thinking thoughtfully about global governance reform in the interests of all. And I think one of the most powerful things we can do at the national level is really to educate on the nature of the global risks. As Arthur was saying, climate change is extremely serious. It's very grave. That means we might go over global tipping points in the global weather systems where we might change the Earth's environment for good, irreversibly. So if you just kind of educate people on the basic information and knowledge of these global risks, what they mean, and also then, okay, the Paris Agreement is not enforceable. How do people feel about that? We generally tend to think that laws should be enforceable in our national jurisdictions. Why is there the International Court of Justice? Why is that not universal if we indeed embrace the rule of law at the national level, etc.? So I think educating on the basics, because the international still seems like a very far off, remote level. And there's a lack of also basic knowledge about current global institutions and also how weak they are. So I think there can be good conversations around that.
What I've been looking at is kind of the changes that we need in defining success. And part of that needs to be, I think, through challenging the underlying assumptions that govern the relationships between individual and collective success. There's this natural tension between individual and collective interests, whether it's within a family, whether it's within a community, and we definitely see it within nations. What are the key attributes of a model that can kind of achieve a higher order of coherence or alignment between individual and collective interests?
Well, I think clearly, at the base, what it is, whether do we accept the oneness of the whole human race, and I think part of it, there's also the question, I think, from Neda about the civil society space and the shrinking role of civil society at the UN. And I think what we're seeing in many countries today is both a rise of authoritarian governance, getting away even from democracy on the one hand, and a rise of extreme individualism, leave everything to the market, the less government, the better. So there are these rather strong forces moving away from any kind of collective view, whether it be individualist in terms of the authoritarian leader who wants to be a despot and one thing for his own personal interest, or each individual saying I come first, and community is either not, you deny that it's there, or if it is, the market will solve the problems and so on, which clearly it doesn't. So I think we're really digging at the level of basic values, people's worldviews, people's whole concept of what is important. And I think that can only be addressed by addressing the worldviews themselves. I mean, the same with climate change. People on the right of the political spectrum deny the science of climate change because it interferes with their worldview. And therefore, this is where ultimately you're only looking at a spiritual and moral ethical level. How do you bring about a transformation in people's worldviews that would then open them up to seeing how individual and collective are totally interlocked, and when you cannot have success in one without the other, the two must go together. It's not just one or the other, it's that they're all part of a whole, with each having its roles at different levels in the way in which you design governance. we can deal with the symptoms because we have, well, there's a basic disease here, and some of our effort has to go to what do we do to try to fix the basic disease, which is the worldviews that people have, very materialistic and individualist oriented, very self-centered, or a worldview that is more open to the larger levels of community and cooperation. And I think that's also, this is why we see a pushback for the civil society at the UN. Those governments that are more authoritarian want to deny their local civil societies at home, and therefore don't want them interfering as well, at the UN level. So it's all part of the same pushback.
Well, a couple of comments. First of all, on the merits of the proposal itself. A few years ago, the Swiss government, together with some other small nations, made a proposal in order to change the concept of veto at the UN Security Council, and they did not succeed. They withdrew their proposal. However, the Swiss ambassador who was involved in that process, when presented the proposal of the book that we are talking about, he said this will have more chances to succeed than the proposal of the 5 small nations that presented it to the Security Council a few years ago, simply because it's a more coherent, complete, and integral proposal. The second thing is how can change come about? If you look at the United Nations site, there is a program called UN at 75. UN at the 75 is a program of the Secretary General of the UN for this year, 2020, which is the 75th anniversary of the UN. And the idea originally was to talk about reform, but the UN realized that, in 1 year you cannot start talking about reform and getting the reform. And therefore, the idea of UN at 75 is to look at the UN 75 years gone and with a view to the year 100, which is 2045. If you look the way this campaign of the UN has been designed, it is based on the conviction that at the level of states, there is little chance to get at this stage a great reform movement happening. Instead, the United Nations Secretary General is thinking that a global campaign involving masses of people and civil society has more chances to obtain a reform of the United Nations system. And the UN at 75 is geared to that. In order to respond to this need, a foundation has been created called Global Governance Forum. Globalgovernanceforum.org is the website for it. And the Global Governance Forum is intending to promote 10,000 conversations around the world on the topic of the reform of the United Nations. In line, and we did this before we knew or before the UN campaign existed. So we are launching a reform, trying to promote 10,000 conversations all around the world. Many of them have taken place already in the last year, at universities, at schools, at all levels, in order to create a global campaign, a global consciousness about the topic, so that if and when the governments finally are obliged to consider a reform, there is a popular support for it and a movement of thinking and serious proposals present at the same time, and start those conversations and interact with the website.
And what I find really interesting about the book and what you've written is that in every step you're addressing some of the challenges that we have, but at the same time, in my mind, I work with the UN as well, and what I see is the obstacles that have intentionally been placed to block it. So, for example, in the concept of a World Parliamentary Assembly that you proposed in Chapter 5, where you have civil society have a voice in the UN equal to that of the member states, because predominantly most of the actions are led by the member states. Well, that would require some sort of a resolution at the General Assembly level. Currently, the space is as such that any civil society organizations that want to be part of negotiations, despite the fact that even those spaces have shrunk, have to be able to attain ECOSOC status. The moment that you are a serious organization that's wanting to engage with the UN, they're completely blocked from being able to get ECOSOC status. I love the concepts and the ideas. I'm kind of questioning of what are the practicable approaches? Have you guys come up with systematic approaches of how to engage? Really, right now, it's the member states who hold the power. What are the strategies that you have thought about putting into place, whether it's partnering up with civil societies like ISHR who work on expanding the space for civil society, or lobbying even, or advocating with member states who may support these ideas and will help promote resolutions and concepts within the UNGA system?
Well, we had planned, a wide campaign around the world, visiting governments, getting people on board, book launches and all the rest of it at a high level with the Secretary General of the UN and others. And of course, the pandemic has put everything on hold. We clearly saw this need. We already had some meeting with ambassadors of different countries. One of them, a very experienced ambassador, from a Latin American country said, normally I'm very skeptical. This is fantastic. I'll sign on tomorrow. Because he said, this is a this fixes everything at once in a coherent way. It's not ticking around the edges. It's really looking at the fundamental problems and proposing rational solutions. We see the need to get people on board, whether it be on the NGO side, working around these intent blockages. Of course, there are always going to be blockages of those countries that want to destroy the UN and prevent it from interfering with what they're doing. And we have to work around those and build momentum outside of those blockages in order to go forward. We've submitted proposals in the Environment Forum and so on to the UN 75 process. So we've been very actively involved in those processes as well to make sure that our ideas are going forward in those different fora.
Like our proposals, I mean, it's over a 500-page book, but we couldn't include everything, obviously, and even to develop the granular detail of the various proposals. Like, indeed, how would we, if we have a civil society chamber, advisory or otherwise, which would be a standing civil society forum, which would be very healthy at the UN, of course, because civil society groups around the world, even in this current imperfect system, have really driven a lot of the progressive developments and change in really an extraordinary way. So this is really important. But then, yes, indeed, how do we make sure that there's a proper vetting and selection that is neutral, that is transparent, that is has the highest levels of integrity and fairness, which is, part of why we've established the Global Governance Forum to think through, the various key main proposals and then develop them further to like, how do you really design an excellent mechanism, an excellent institution based on the highest standards of governance integrity?
I think actually that my question was really in terms of the scientific assumptions that are used in a lot of the arguments. So in the UK, with the current pandemic, they often talk about scientific advice. But actually, the problem is that it depends what your objectives are. One of the big issues we have is in terms of one's worldview, and that determines one's values. And I think the trouble is that a lot of this people say, oh yes, we're using best scientific advice. They're not making it explicit what their values are underlying that.
I think that's precisely the issue, that the science is there, but if you're filtering that through a worldview that doesn't want to deny certain kinds of actions, then no amount of science is going to change things, and therefore we have to deal with it at global levels. There was a question, I think, briefly from Ramin about faith-based institutions, and I think since we're talking about values, that's really where we need to say, how can we bring all those organizations dealing with values and looking at building, those changes in worldviews, or at least showing how the traditional values of their faith lead to a more open worldview and not an exclusive one. Many of the basic teachings actually are very open and can be used to argue for unity. We need to find all of those more progressive forces in the faith groups and get them on board as well.
I just wondered if you'd looked at the UN humanitarian system for models and ideas and institutional strengthening. It seems to me that, from working a bit in the UN humanitarian system, that it's kind of working as a backdrop to the political system. And we don't see it so visibly, except when there's a crisis and we see World Food Program and UNICEF and others responding, but there's a massive functioning system there, which has some pretty good models, in fact, on global coordination, principle-based. They embrace civil society and NGOs. They depend on them. In fact, every meeting, coordination meeting on a humanitarian response is half NGOs and faith-based organizations and half UN, and then maybe some government. And it functions. It also it's regulated at an international level by the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, which is a combination of NGOs and UN agencies, which functions as a body and committee, not an executive committee, a regulating kind of norm-based body. But it seems to me there's so many interesting angles there, and just how some of those institutions are being strengthened. I mean, World Food Program is becoming very, very powerful organization. They have amazing supply chains, logistics, ability to reach anywhere so quickly, almost like a military force, frankly. I mean, UNHCR can set up, millions of people in no time with, running water. There's a massive system there. And it seemed to me in the Baha'i writings, I don't know where exactly, that there had been a reference to the fact that it will be also humanitarian organizations, which will help to roll out a new world order.
Clearly, there are lots of good things going on in the UN. I mean, I myself, when I was in UNEP, served on an interagency group on humanitarian assistance within civil society organizations. We saw how well it worked. Part of the problem, of course, is that we function in silos. How well is that system linked to the pandemic response of WHO, or are there still barriers between the parts of the system that could coordinate better to pass the lessons on more easily and draw on each other's quality experiences going ahead? I think this is where some more coherent coordination across the different parts of the system will allow it to be even more effective in using all those good qualities and taking them forward.
And also, Rhonda, it sort of illustrates the point of like the maturity of the international system in various areas and in various institutions or across institutions for collaboration, rapid action. And you see that in different fields, in different agencies, like in international law. It's very mature at this moment. We have a maturity which now is not being taken forward, in our very fundamental institutions, and fundamental instruments like the Charter, for example. So, I mean, it's precisely those sorts of systems that are mature that we have to keep looking at and bringing also to the forefront to show how functional we can be as an international community, and also the best of global human collaboration.
Okay. So I just wanted to thank the authors for a fantastic book. I'm still working my way through it, but it's very rich. I want to particularly focus on the chapter 20 on the values and principles. That's related to my two questions. So one, in terms of the book, it mentions the need to internalize those shared values. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more in terms of how you envision that process happens of the internalization. Is it primarily with government officials, leaders, or with the citizenry where you think that needs to happen? And then second, Maya's comment about we're living in a values-rich environment at the UN. Is there a concern that, in this age of short attention span and people being overwhelmed with what do I do with all of these values? Every day there's new ones. How do I prioritize? Where do I start?
In the chapter on values, we recognize that you have to actually deal at multiple levels. I mean, ultimately, because we talk about eventually having an elected General Assembly. By this would mean educating the whole world citizenship to the values necessary to be responsible electors, and that might take decades to reach that point. But it needs to be something to be aimed for. We also recognize that when we need to have, you might say, training programs for new recruits to international civil service, which would be, sharing, the core values of the organization and, getting buy-in and understanding and appreciation of these values in order for them to carry out their functions within the secretariats more effectively. The biggest challenge probably is to educate all of those who are part of the UN at a diplomatic level, where you have the political leaders, the diplomats and Ministry of Foreign Affairs and so on, and it's a more difficult sort of reach them to get them to be educated to the set of values. But this requires really a campaign at all levels to acknowledge that we're not only looking at a set of institutions. The institutions are only going to be good as the values of the people making them work from the inside. And therefore, this has to be part of the focus of transformation that is required.
I think, general public education is extremely important, and it's an area on values and international instruments, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the UN Charter, which most people don't know the basic principles and values in the Charter. And I've even met ambassadors of Western nations who don't know some of the basic principles or mechanisms of the Charter for some reason. I mean, yeah, I completely agree with Arthur that we have to have education across the board, individuals within institutions, within national governments. For example, lawyers in every country in the world, they don't usually have a international law program course which is mandatory. But with all the international regulations and laws, this should obviously be obligatory at this point. Talk about the importance of educating the public around the world on the SDGs, on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, on the Convention, on all human rights. So this is, I mean, we talk about it in the book on the chapter of education. Yeah, states have to scale up their national education efforts on international issues and norms and values. So there has to be a big international educational push, which also is not going to be easy. I've started recently discussing with a few colleagues the development of an international like peace history textbook or history of international organizations for wider dissemination, because this is even rare. Most children in schools are still learning about only their, national military exploits. And I think you see with the SDGs, for example, because they talk about the responsibilities of individuals and companies, they're being quite widely dispersed, at least, for example, in the Netherlands or other European countries. So they're kind of traveling and gaining common currency much more than previously. But I think still a lot of work has to be done on those core values and principles. And again, I would come back to the Charter and like really core international principles there. The famous US legal scholar Lewis Henkin says, the Charter has outlawed war. It's, you shouldn't be hearing the term war, and it doesn't exist. The Charter outlawed it. 193 states around the world have signed it. Everyone has agreed, but yet we're still using this terminology war. We're still talking about superpowers. So it's also like a cultural shift, like at the macro kind of military geopolitical scale, that we haven't, as a global culture, recognized. We haven't yet internalized the basic norms of the UN Charter. And I guess we all have to play a part in that solution at all levels in every venue.
We need everybody to work to get the word out that we need to start addressing the governance level, and that this is all part of the solutions to the problems we're facing immediately. And let's try to build the momentum.